go ahead and get things kicked off here. And so, good morning, Pat, Hugh, Bob. On behalf of everybody here on the call, and I know we'll have some trickling in as we go through this, and hopefully they can just kind of keep flowing in. Just want to say thank you to the Envision team for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here with us and share your stories and lessons. For everybody on the call, I met Pat through a piece of training earlier this spring, and we've continued to connect and collaborate and routinely meet. And we were talking in the June timeframe and thought that this would have been a phenomenal opportunity for folks that are engineering leaders here in the Baker Hughes Subsea Drilling Systems team to take a pause, take some time out, and hear from really experienced and talented group of people that have real life experience in crisis management, change management, and give us a little bit of perspective on the COVID-19 situation that we're all going through. Everyone on this call from my organization is a leader, and we really have experienced and continue to experience tremendous change in how we operate and organize as a business, change in what our customers do and what they expect of us. And really the fact of the matter is it is probably going to continue to evolve for us. And at Baker Hughes, we've got 4 key values as a company. We all know them: grow, care, collaborate, and lead. And you can make a really strong argument that any one of the 4 is a valid purpose for this sort of discussion, but I'd really say it's the grow value to focus on, because rooted in that grow value is embracing change, being ready for change, adopting change. And as I said, we're going to hear some people that went through some pretty tremendous experiences and radical change, and we're going to continue to experience that in our industry as well. So with that, I'm really excited to hear from the group here. If you got questions, please use that chat feature, and I'll hand it over to you, Pat, to lead it through and introduce your team. So thank you very much, and I'm really excited for this.
Yeah, I'm excited as well, Mike, and thanks so much. And it's been a pleasure working with you and others within the Baker Hughes team. We actually did a very similar session a number of weeks ago with your flexible pipe division with Ruggiero and his team, Ruggiero based in Newcastle, England. I just wanted to say welcome. Today's topic is leading and managing from adversity to recovery. And talk about a timely topic at a very interesting time in our lives. I think this is the first time, Bob, if you don't mind me saying, this is the first time that the entire world is impacted by something extremely similar. And it's the first time that every single organization in the world literally had your strategy thrown out the window and you've got to rebuild it. Now, today's topic is really going to be focused on handing off ideas, tactics, and strategies to best manage through the 4 phases of dealing with adversity. And on today's call, I've got 2 distinguished gentlemen that both bring a unique perspective to change. And interestingly enough, the change that Bob Peterson has gone through, he's gone through 4 major price adjustments in his years as a strategy consultant in the oil and gas industry. Bob and I met about 8 or so years ago on a flight between Dallas and Canada up here in Calgary. And again, I like to consider Bob as probably one of the top strategists in the oil and gas industry. Bob, if you wanted to make an introduction beyond that, please go ahead.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, I've been in the industry now almost 40 years. The first half of my career with Mobil, ExxonMobil, and then Schlumberger, and the second half of my career on the other side of the table in management consulting. As Pat said, I've seen 4 major price shocks, 2 minor pandemics, and now a major pandemic. This is the first time a price shock and a pandemic have coincided and literally affects every individual on the planet and every business on the planet. So my context is, I've lived through massive restructuring in the energy industry. I've lived through the growth explosion of the shale advent, and now dealing with the high volatility brought onto us by COVID and the associated price shock. So happy to share a bit of my experience, and back over to you, Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And at times I just wish I could plug in a fiber optic cable in between our minds to download what you know within the industry. And the other gentleman who's on the call today is Dr. Hugh Dunleavy. And Dr. Hugh and I actually used to do some work on behalf of Hugh when I met him at a Canadian airline called WestJet. And he moved on after that to an organization called Malaysia Airlines, where he handled as one of the senior leaders the tragedies of both MH370 and MH17 and talk about an adverse environment. Hugh, background in theoretical physics and specialty in financial modeling. Hugh, would you like to say anything beyond that as an introduction?
No, I won't say too much, but good morning, everyone. I will try and convey the learnings that we had at Malaysia Airlines in going through those two tragedies and also working in an incredibly volatile environment where almost anything can happen on a day-to-day basis. And I know it may sound strange to bring a relationship between two airline tragedies into how we're dealing with the pandemic, but it is all about how you address basically a very serious adverse activity in your environment, and then how do you pull your people together to make sure that they're all aligned and that you look for solutions as you move forward. So I'll try and put that in context as we go through the presentation today.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. And it's interesting. Mike had made the comment at the very beginning of the call. As we go through this presentation, there's never a bad question. What we'll do is we'll watch our chat feature within Microsoft Teams. And if you wanted to highlight that now, take a peek at that. We'll be asking to draw on that a few different times as well through this presentation, just to seek some group input so that you can see what some of your peers are thinking on select topics. But please watch that as we continue through. Now, our agenda for today is as follows. What we'll be doing beyond introductions is the example of leading, from adversity to recovery really is going to be twofold. It's going to start with the Malaysia Airlines example with Dr. Hugh. And what we'll be doing from there is speaking about leading self, leading teams, and leading organizations as the next three items after that. Now, it's interesting because we all know as we board an aircraft, and Hugh, in your industry, usually when you get on board during the safety demonstration, what would the flight crew typically ask of people as individuals?
Yes. Put your oxygen mask on for yourself first, and then take care of the people around you.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about strategies to ensure that each one of you as leaders on this call today have tactics to share with members of your team. And of course, leading teams is not just leading teams. We all have family at work, but we also have family at home. And so we'll be speaking about some strategies to lead the people you have around you at work, but also in your personal lives, communities, extended family, etc. And then finally, drawing both on Bob's and Hughes' plus 40 plus years in each respective industry, we're going to finish by talking about some strategies that may assist each one of you on the call with the leading of your organizations. Now, what's interesting, this being an image, actual image of MH370 taken some years ago, far over 6 years ago. Hugh, one morning you were taking a taxi ride from your home in Kuala Lumpur into the airport, and you received a phone call early that morning that really changed your life as we know it. Do you want to pick up from there?
Yes. Obviously, in the airline industry, we practice for dealing with tragedies. I mean, that's just part of the business environment. We go through training exercises in every year. But just imagine that you tell your CEO that we want to do a training scenario in which the aircraft mysteriously goes missing. We're not going to find it. And we're going to spend a year or more looking for the aircraft without any success. Those type of scenarios are not ones that you'd regularly practice. Normally, the aircraft has had an incident on the runway, or it's gone off the runway or something like that, or it's had an accident on the runway. And then all of your resources from the airline are at that airport and you can fix things. The reality, of course, in this scenario is that the challenge was there was very little information. We didn't know what we didn't know. All we knew is that we'd lost contact with an aircraft, and that our problem was, well, how do we find out what's happening? Who do we activate? Sea Air Rescue, and then you tell Sea Air Rescue we've lost a plane, and they ask you immediately, well, where do you want us to go look? And you say, not really sure yet. We just lost contact with the aircraft, don't know where it is. And that was probably a thematic that went through the whole scenario in dealing with MH370. We didn't know at the time that it was going to become a worldwide mystery. We probably didn't appreciate just how emotional the situation would be in Beijing when I and my first responder team arrived in Beijing that very evening. For us, we got there as quickly as we could, but for the family members, it was 12 hours after they'd been first informed that the aircraft with their family members was missing. So a lot of anger, a lot of emotion, and we're not a Chinese company. Therefore, there's a lot of animosity that derives through the day. And of course, when you get a group of people together that are all upset, they tend to feed on each other and the situation gets very bad. But you've got some relatively young people who are your first responders and they're trying to help. And the initial reaction with people was that they just didn't want help. They just wanted to express their anger and their emotions. And quite frankly, as we talk through the rest of the session today, it is important that people do express their emotion, because until they express it, you can't really get them to a stage where you can start to help and let them know you're there to assist. From our point of view, with MH370, we didn't have any idea at the start that that mystery might never be solved. And when I say might never, maybe in 50 years' time, some research boat will be going down in the southern Indian Ocean, will come across the wreckage, maybe not. But at the time, you're always hoping that you're going to get information that at least you can give some confirmation of the family members that we've found the wreckage and that we'll be going into a recovery mode. Not only that, because of the scale of the problem, we were supporting more than 1,500 family members in Beijing for probably more than 6 months. We didn't know the scale of the support that we needed. We were very fortunate in having not only the Malaysian government support us, but also the Chinese government, who gave us all the support we could possibly ask for. But I want to be clear about that. And you'll see this in the theme, is that the Chinese government were absolutely essential to our support work there. They gave us all the support we could need. But they made one thing very, very clear. They said, Hugh, we'll give you all the support you need in terms of security, ambulances, access to hospitals, doctors, etc. But just remember, it's your problem. You have to fix it. So it's your situation. We'll help you, but we're going to stay in the background. And one of the things we learned very quickly is you have to communicate, communicate, and communicate. There's no way you can under-communicate. Initially, the family members wanted us to give them updates every 15 minutes. Now, rationally, that doesn't make much sense, because when a boat is searching the Indian Ocean, it doesn't travel very far in 15 minutes. But as far as the family members were concerned, they were still optimistic that we would find their family members in a life raft or something like that. So they wanted to know as quickly as possible. Eventually, we compromised and got them down to, we'll give you an update at 9 a.m., just after breakfast, at midday, and at 5 p.m. in the evening. So you've got at least an update continuously. Now, quite frankly, even that frequency of update is difficult to maintain, because even in a 3-hour or 4-hour session, a boat still doesn't go very far. But that's what we decided we would do for the family members. The important thing was that we learned very quickly, know your facts, or at least as much as you do know. And if you're not 100% confident in the information, be honest and inform them, because quite frequently we were given information from various government sources from different countries, which turned out to be not as accurate as it was initially portrayed to be. So then when we as an airline pass that information on to the family members, and it turns out to be not as accurate as we thought it was, then there's that belief that we told them untruths. Whereas in fact, that wasn't the case. It was just, whenever you have a process that involves people, mistakes happen. And sometimes it's just a translation of a location on a map, etc., or the time of day that a satellite photograph was taken. Little things like that get blown out of proportion, and it gives rise to what we now see as the, what would you call it, conspiracy theorists who jump on every little piece of information and then blow it out of proportion. We also learned that you need to take care of your people first. They're my first responders. They're my frontline people. If they don't believe you have their back and are there to support them, how can we expect them to take care of the family members? So that was a very important point. And we were dealing with highly emotional people, high stress levels, and frequently people are working 24-hour shifts before getting a break to go and get some rest. So it's a very tricky situation, and each person you interact with will respond very differently. So for example, in some of our situations, we recognized that although we had given everyone the same type of training, when it comes to, the rubber hitting the road, certain individuals are not cut out for doing this type of high emotional stress situations, and we would have to send them back to Kuala Lumpur. It's not saying that they were bad people. It was just that they couldn't handle the stress. And if they can't handle the stress, they can't handle the family members. So we had to rotate people through that fairly quickly. And in fact, over the first 4 weeks, we probably used up more than 1,000 of our first responders because of the challenges. We were also complicated by the fact that little things that you would not normally think about would be an issue was how many people in our airline spoke Mandarin. Now, we're very fortunate in Malaysia that our population is 1/3 ethnic Chinese, 1/3 Malay, and 1/3 ethnic Indian. So we did have quite a few people that actually spoke Mandarin and were able to help us. But in many cases, we found that speaking the language wasn't the issue. Just having someone there that they could talk to, even though they knew they didn't understand them, was less of an issue than you might believe. What they wanted to do was have someone to sit there, listen to them, show them photographs of their family members, and know that someone from the company was listening to them. The other thing we didn't recognize is just, particularly if you're in a business to consumer environment, the impact of social media. Conspiracy theories, if you don't respond quickly, they just grow out of all proportion. So we had to set up a system where we respond to 85% of all social media tweets on all the major platforms within 15 minutes. That is a massive amount of undertaking. And if you don't do that, then the stories run away from you very quickly. We also had significant hacker attacks from various national entities. And at peak time, we were in the millions of hits per second trying to bring down our website. We were fortunate that we'd only recently upgraded our entire infrastructure so that none of the attacks were able to damage our systems. But the interesting thing is that don't assume that everyone out there is giving you the right information or they're always out there to help you. So there was a lot of learning we had, and a lot of learnings we incorporated into our processes. Not that we thought we'd need them again, but unfortunately, 4 months after the loss of MH370, we had our second aircraft shot down over the Ukraine in that conflict zone there. And the challenge there, of course, was that enormous brand damage happens to your airline when things like this happen. Now, particularly in parts of the world where there's a lot of superstition, then you're an unlucky airline. And I must admit that during that period of time, we probably dropped 50 to 60% of all our business because people were afraid to fly with us. We had to rebuild that again, but as you know, probably takes decades to build up a really strong and robust brand, but it takes literally minutes to destroy it. And in this case, 2 very disastrous situations happened to us, and there were long-term ramifications that went way beyond just the initial incidents of just losing one aircraft and having the second aircraft shot down. Little things that you don't sorry.
I was just going to say, Hugh, it's interesting, sort of jump in. You look at that image that's in the upper right-hand side of the screen right now. It's interesting because the pressure, many of the questions that come from people when we deliver this presentation is, how do you stay resilient as a leader? You had that image was 3 times a day for 4 months straight, 7 days a week. Is that correct?
Well, this is the reconstruction of the wreckage that we had from MH17. So as part of our normal accident investigation issue, we work with the FAA, the Dutch authorities, the Malaysian authorities to try and find out exactly what happened, because there's always a political dimension as well. In this case, you can see clearly the damage to the left-hand side of the aircraft, if you're sitting on the aircraft, which is obviously where the missile exploded and brought the aircraft down. I think the issue is, what's important is that you and you have to present direction to your team. You have to be calm, you have to be confident, you have to be able to listen to them and point out that there will be an airline at the end of this journey. We just have to get through this issue together. And the way to do that is to support each other as opposed to pointing fingers. Always going to do things that may not have been perfect. Those things are just natural day of life. That's what management is about. You fix things that someone else broke. May not have done it deliberately, but that's what management is about. So as a leader, your job is to provide a vision of what the future is like, and then help them get through it and be there to listen to them as they run through various issues during the course of the day, depending on who or what they encountered. So with that, I'll hand it back
Well,
to you,
yeah,
Pat.
and thank you, Hugh. Just a summary of learnings. I'm going to put some of the summary up on the screen. You've covered many of these points off already, but what would you say during this time of COVID and some of the uncertainty that we're facing? What would be some of the important learnings to take away from your experience with Malaysia Airlines, and to really pass that on to others who are listening in right now?
Right. If you're not a business to consumer, then the social media aspect is probably not that important to you. But if you're a business to consumer industry, that social media now can be a death stroke to you as an organization. The main thing is that there's lots of things we don't know. Through a pandemic, we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know the severity. We don't know if and when the vaccine will be developed. And if it is developed, will it be as effective as we believe it to be? But what we do know is that if you leave gaps in people's information, so they're not aware of what's going on, they'll invent things to fill in that gap. So communicate. That's the most important thing. Know as much, and I think I mentioned it, know as much as you can, but when there are areas that either you're not sure of the value of the source, or it may be very likely to change the next day, tell your people up front. That way they're being pre-advised, as opposed to, you said this yesterday, now you're saying something else the next day. They think you're just changing the story as opposed to updating them on the latest information. So I think those are two important ones. But one that I think we underestimate a huge amount is you have to take care of your people. A leader's responsibility is to take care of his people anyway. But when you're going through a very stressful crisis like we went through at Malaysia Airlines, or which we're now going through with the pandemic, you need to make sure you're listening to what's going on with your people. And frequently, people's image to you, how they present themselves to you, does not reflect how they're really feeling. So you do have to spend some time listening to them. In the case of the pandemic, for example, we don't know whether the staff member is handling it okay, or whether he's just found out that a family member has been diagnosed with the virus, etc. So giving people time to express their feelings, listening to them, and giving them the support that's necessary, I think are key learnings that we had from MH370, and we're able to leverage that during the MH17 scenario.
Now, what's interesting, Hugh, what we're showing on the screen right now, we call this the roller coaster of change. And I know a number of you on the call who've been through the Envision training through PISA, the Petroleum Equipment and Services Association. This is actually a component of our leadership training, because leaders are in a position to help guide others towards a vision. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But in terms of this chart, you can see that at the top left side, we start with blind optimism. This COVID situation really isn't happening. The shock and denial, maybe a feeling of loss. Why am I stuck in my chair at home on Teams and Zoom calls all day? Confusion and anger could really result as a result of change. And now, the pit of despair for COVID might not be a pit. It might be more of a runway, just because we've been in a position of that nature for some time. But the interesting thing is, Hugh, in your experience with MH370 versus MH17, how long did it really take you to go from the top left of the roller coaster down to the pit of despair?
Yeah, for me, it probably took about 5 hours. I found out about the emergency call out around about 4 a.m. when I was arriving at the airport. And by 9 a.m. that morning, that's the time the aircraft should have been landing in Beijing. And of course, we've been trying to contact it for the previous 4 or 5 hours without any success. So at every stage, you're feeling an increasing sense of dread that something bad has happened, but we're unable to confirm it. But it took about, from my case, about 5 hours. From my operations people, it was probably about same amount of time. Once they knew they'd been unable to contact the aircraft for 3 or 4 hours, which is very unusual in a commercial airline, then they knew something bad had happened. But let's use 5 hours as an example of the MH370 from the very, very top of, it's just another regular day at the airline to we have a major crisis on our hand and we've lost a lot of people.
Now, it's interesting. A call came through, an item came through in the chat. There's a question, and the question is this, Hugh. How do you think through how confident you need to be in the information you have to share with the stakeholders at that given time? How do you really do that?
That's a really good question. Your normal approach to dealing with information is that if it comes from a government agency, and this might be, and it could be multiple governments, and they've got satellite photographs of the region and they're giving you information, They've seen some wreckage in the ocean, and so therefore you send ships to that area only to discover it's wooden pallets that have been floating in the ocean that have fallen off some ship. It is very difficult. What we learned very quickly was that to be very secure is that we would always start a conversation saying, the latest information we've received is this. Here's the source. Now, sometimes we were not allowed to mention the source for security issues, but if it's a commercial environment, we'd always mention the source and then say, this is the latest information, but it's likely to change as we continue our investigation and the search process. But it's also trial and error. We frequently got information coming in that we knew was from a social media source, and then I treated those with a high degree of skepticism, because I will tell you that after we did our press release and our media at 9 a.m. in the morning in Kuala Lumpur, we'd already activated our emergency response call centers. We deactivated our normal commercial website, and we put on what we call a dark site, which had no advertising. It just gave schedule and booking information. It took maybe an hour for the first crazies, and I use that word advisedly, to start calling into our call centers, blocking up lines which are there for family members, telling us that the aircraft has crashed off the coast of Sumatra, or it's off another vacation island just off the coast of Malaysia. It literally, people are spending more time focusing on what they can do to provide false information, all of which by the way, we are forced to investigate. Why? Because you don't know that it's 100% true, false, until you send a plane or a ship into that area, or you call up the local police authority and discover there's nothing going on out there. But you've diverted essential resources that could have been moved to a more beneficial area with realistic information. So be prepared. We're seeing it here, right? A lot of information is going out on pandemic. There's a disbelief now in the scientific information, which baffles me as a scientist. But that's the way it is. It is amazing how many people will start believing in almost any story that's put out there, regardless of either the source or the quality of information that's out there. So be prepared, but you actually just learn along the way that depending on the source of information, you put a ranking in terms of how believable it is, and then you always emphasize to the audience that here's my level of confidence in this, and here's the source. That's the best thing you can do.
Yeah, no, Hugh, it's interesting. And thank you, David, for that question. Raj posted another question here. Hugh, you mentioned about the importance of emotional resilience. And Bob, I'd like to draw on you for this too. But first, Hugh, how do you train for emotional resilience?
Yeah, that's another really great question. And what we found was that when you, as an airline, we obviously ask people to become part of our first responders. The bigger the airline, the more likely we are to have more people available for us to train. So you go through the regular training, but they know that it's training. It's not a real scenario. And sometimes we'd go through full scenarios with people dressed up in bandages, just to make sure that people get a real full understanding of what's happened in some sort of disaster. But people know it's a training exercise. And how they're going to react in a training exercise can and is very different in a real life scenario. And I touched on it a little bit. We did find a subset of the people that we sent with us initially to Beijing were not able to handle the stress levels. I think you saw some of the photographs. There was not just a lot of emotion, there was a lot of anger, okay? And there was a lot of blaming of who was involved in it. Now, I don't happen to fly planes, but I do happen to work for an airline. And as the senior guy, I was the one that's the point of those aggression. I think I told Pat that one day when I gave the announcement that it's now 13 hours since the aircraft went missing, the only thing I can really tell you is that we don't know where the aircraft is, but we can tell you it's no longer flying because it's run out of fuel. When I did that, then the emotions hit the roof. In China, we had a situation where the Chinese government allows people to show their emotion and anger at people by throwing bottles of water at you. I was not aware of that cultural issue. Now, the good thing is that they don't hurl them at you like they do with a baseball. They just lob them to hit you on the chest just to demonstrate that they're not very happy with you. And after I finished that session and the police were with me, I said, what was all that about? And they said, yeah, we have to do that here in China. It allows people to let off their emotions, without causing a major issue. He said, the good news is if they started throwing hard objects such as phones and chairs, we'd have stepped in and stopped it. And I kept thinking it would have been good to have known that before I went into that session to give people probably the worst news that they're going to receive about their family members. But it is a process, and you're right, to expect very young people who are junior in their career to be able to handle that, that's almost impossible. The main thing is you have to have years of experience going through lots of crises, maybe perhaps not as bad as this, but you also know it's your responsibility to lead the people. If you start panicking and you start flip-flopping from one direction to another and don't know how to respond to people, how can you expect your team to follow you? So it is important that you're calm, you're confident, and you admit to them, I'm not sure about this piece of information. I'm waiting for more follow-up to confirm it, but this is the best information we have. So this is what I'm going to communicate, and this is how we're going to do it. And that's the process we went through. By the way, if you're doing it 3 times a day, as we were in Beijing, after you've gone through a few days of that, you get into a rhythm of what you have to do. The other issue is that you cannot afford to hide in your room away from the family members. It is very important that you're out there meeting and listening to the family members. And I was fortunate most of the time I did have a translator, but when you're listening to them talk to you one-on-one, you can then reflect that back in when you're talking to a big room of both media and family members. So there's a learning component to it, but it's also important to listen to what those people are saying. Long answer, so I apologize for that. Over to you, Pat.
Hey, Pat, you still there?
I think he's frozen. Shall I continue?
Well, I can.
Yes.
Yeah, I can offer a perspective on personal resilience. I think it a little bit different. My experience certainly is very different from yours, Hugh. But I think it starts with managing yourself. You know, faced with whatever the situation is, do you believe that there is an outcome, a positive outcome? You've got to convince yourself of that, because people around you feed off of your emotion and your attitude. I think so. Will there be a positive outcome? Yes. Do I believe that? Yes. Can I communicate that to my followers? Yes. And I think it's also important what I do with respect to the coronavirus and the price shock is I don't spend a lot of time dwelling on it. I devote maybe 15 minutes in the morning to check my trusted sources of information on corona, energy industry, absorb the information, and then I move on. And I think the other point that Hugh touched on is you've got to find some avenue of personal release. You know, is it exercise? Is it meditation? Is it interacting with your family? And we'll talk a bit more about that as we get into the remainder of the discussion.
Absolutely. Now, am I back with you guys?
Yeah,
Yes,
you're back.
Yeah, good stuff. And pardon the brief pause there for a moment. Now, it's interesting in conversation, Bob, with both you and with you, Hugh. It's there's really 4 phases of crisis management as we know it. You know, the first step, and this is where we're going to ask for a little interaction on the chat feature on Microsoft Teams. Now, the first step is we have to recognize something's going on. And of course, as a leadership group, for all of you within the company, within Baker Hughes around the world, you have to begin responding to it. Then, of course, what happens is all of us start to revisit our strategic plans and our actions, and we begin to recover from this whole situation. And then, of course, the 4th phase of crisis management is to resume regular business as we know it. Now, what we'd like to do, we've done this in every call that we've been running, and being that we're recording this call, it's interesting to see from your peers. Take a moment now, go into the chat feature within Microsoft Teams and just type in the number of the phase that you believe you and your team are at currently as we manage through this adverse time through COVID and even the oil price shock. So just take a moment now and type in the number. We'll come back to some of the other questions that were posed because they will be items that are included within the content of this conversation. But just take a moment and type in the number that you believe you're at now. You know, some are resuming regular day-to-day business. Many are still responding, and it's overwhelming. We've been seeing, Bob, consistently that there's an average of about 2 point something, as everybody considers, as we're seeing the numbers come in.
Yeah. We're seeing close to 3 recovery, which it's interesting. We did this seminar a couple times this week with airlines, and as you might expect, given the trauma they've suffered to their business, they're more back in solidly in the response stage, figuring out just how do we manage this situation. Whereas energy companies that we've talked to, like yourself, tend to be more in the high twos, low threes.
Well, it's pretty interesting. High twos, low threes. So that's actually very interesting, and just in terms of the responses we're getting from everybody. Now, looking at these 4 phases, we'll revisit these in just a moment. So thank you to everybody who actually responded and put in the numbers. Very interesting indeed. Now, here are some numbers that were available this morning at about 6:55 a.m. Central Time in Houston. The global population is about 7.8 billion people. The US population, 326 million. Canada is a subset of that, about 1/10. But the US COVID cases today, according to the Johns Hopkins website, and we'll stress that we are not medical experts, but just following the data that's being listed on the Johns Hopkins website, US COVID cases were 13,323 this morning. Canadian cases at 110,000. Now, it's interesting here where you look at the mortality rate is typically 0.88% in normal times. Now, the COVID mortality rate is estimated to be, by the Johns Hopkins site, approximately 3.5% versus the flu, which is only 0.1. And we're seeing those numbers come through. Now, it's interesting because, Bob, I know that the data on the left-hand side of the screen is somewhat dated now, but it was interesting. There is a survey conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers on, the estimate how long it would take for your company to get back to business as usual. And even back in May, look at some of these numbers, right?
Yeah, it's as you said, it's the survey here is a bit old. It was conducted from the data was gathered from, I think, a large number of CFOs estimating time to business as usual. And I think in the context of the survey, it was very much a V-shaped recovery from the virus. I think with the resurgence, we're seeing more of an L. And I believe if you went back and resurveyed these same CFOs, you would probably, instead of 6 months to recovery, you will probably would hear 1 to 2 years to recovery. And that just emphasizes the volatility of the current situation. The bit of good news that I saw this morning on my morning scan is one of the drug development company has had 100% positive results on their vaccine generating antibodies. So that's a good initial leading piece of information that we should all watch very closely, because that will affect whether this is an L or it's a U in terms of recovery.
Absolutely. No, it's interesting, Bob, because we look at this whole situation with COVID, and it's complicated by what you're seeing on the screen right now. This is the price chart of WTI West Texas, and it's interesting because back in late March, it looks like that chart almost melted and it just dropped down into the negatives. What can you say about this? And even looking forward beyond, this was taken actually this morning at 6:58 a.m. Houston time. But what can you say about this chart?
Well, I think there's 2 observations. One, the spike downward was unprecedented in the history of the oil industry. For a while, the price of WTI went negative, about $40 a barrel, because there was too much oil and no one knew how to get rid of it. But on the positive side, we've seen a fairly rapid recovery. The average WTI at $41 a barrel, that's globally, that's about the average break even in terms of production of oil around the world. So that's good news in a sense that probably, a large portion of producers are now beginning to make money, whilst there's still a large portion who are losing cash. And so that ultimately we expect to see a pretty significant restructuring of the industry. But the other good news is if you look at forecasts for 2021, both EIA and IEA, the expectation is demand will recover to probably 95% of pre-COVID. So that coupled with the significant reduction in capital budgets bodes well for the continued rise in the price of oil. We may see $50, $60 a barrel as we get toward the mid to end 2021, which is good.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's going to be big changes. And I know at the start of the pandemic, the big issue was toilet paper, and now the issue is actually bike parts and going to a bicycle store if anybody's looking to buy a bike these days. It's interesting how the impact of this has been on supply chain, not just on oil and gas, but on supply chain overall. Do you want to comment on that briefly?
Yeah, I think this probably will begin to affect the oil industry as well, Pat, but just because of the global lockdown, but also concern about essential supplies, certainly in the medical field, and maybe to a lesser extent in energy and manufacturing, is companies and countries are all looking to bring critical parts of the supply chain physically back within their borders. Haven't seen this with respect to the global market for oil, which is good, but we definitely will see supply chain consolidation, de-risking, and where it's deemed either critical to a country's security or the manufacturing of critical supplies likely to see supply chains physically shortened.
So, it's interesting, Bob. All of this said, we look at getting back to the agenda here, and it's interesting, leading self. And just a couple of notes here. First off, Raj, thank you for your comment on emotional resilience. At the end of the session, if you'd like to take our info at envisiongroup.ca website down, I'd be happy to send you more on the topic. There's a gentleman by the name of Daniel Goleman, an author, who's written on emotional intelligence, and within his book, he speaks about emotional resilience, and I can get more information to you on that. And also a question by Alex just a moment ago. Bob, do you know of, or Hugh, do you know of any books that would be recommended on disaster preparedness and specifically how a team should be structured to deal with response? Is there anything you have out there as literature, or would you need a few moments on that, either Bob or Hugh?
Yeah, I would need a few moments on that. There are books that have been written on crisis management, disaster management. I don't have them to hand at the moment, but I'll look through my library and give you a few references on that.
Yeah. Sorry, Bob, go ahead.
I don't have anything at hand, but you and I can do a bit of research and maybe provide some references.
And Hugh, I know that within your teams and Bob that you've dealt with this in the past, but it's just a matter of going back into the repositories to learn. Yeah. Now, leading self is an interesting concept because, as Hugh said at the start of the call, we've all got to put our oxygen mask on first. And to put our oxygen mask on first, and let's talk a little bit about resilience, because the roller coaster, as we redrew it, this is the same as the roller coaster of change, showing the different stages people go through. What this roller coaster shows each one of us is the emotions that are related to those stages. And what's interesting, to move towards recovery or even resumption, which is really the acceptance and moving on with new confidence, really look at some of the emotions that each one of you are managing within your teams, your families, your communities. It's just interesting. Now, what we always say is when on the left-hand side of this roller coaster, we're gifted, Bob, with 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, aren't we?
Yeah, and that's obviously to listen. Hugh said earlier, an important practice managing the Malaysian airline crises was to communicate. He also noted that people cannot move on until they express their emotion. So that emphasizes to me the importance of listening multiple times. Generally speaking, if you're subject to major trauma, major change, individuals will need to express their emotion multiple times, and they will go up and down the despair to hope roller coaster probably 3 or 4 times. And so that places emphasis on the importance of listening, being a counselor, being a coach. In my experience, going through some major reorganizations within Mobil, ExxonMobil, Schlumberger, I literally spent 50% of my time listening to employees and hearing their fears, allaying their fears, and counseling them on how are we going to get through this event.
Well, and Bob, this is an interesting fact is, people make decisions with emotion and they back it up with logic. And the interesting thing about, many engineers on the call, if not most of the group here from Baker Hughes, emotion is something that is an item to be tended to during times of crisis. And what we can say is looking at some of the items that really deliver resilience. When we put our oxygen masks on first, I'd like each one of you to look at the items. There's 4 key areas that when combined really do help deliver resilience. So Raj, as you're looking for items related to that, and even Alex, the question you'd posed, do a little 1 to 10 on each one of these items. And the 1 to 10 is you can't manage what you don't measure. And each one of us as leaders, you look at how well are you sleeping? I know that I've got my bottle of water with me for hydration on my all-day stint, usually spending 8 to 10 hours in front of a camera on Teams and Zoom calls. But ensuring your diet, movement. You look at some of the psychological factors, emotional and community. And, Hugh, looking at what you had to go through in China, in Beijing, for 4 straight months, and then, of course, a reiteration of that with the second tragedy of MH17. If you were actually to give some counsel to anybody in resilience, which items really stand out to you on this page?
Yeah, that's a really tough question because all 4 are important. But to me, the 2 that really came to fore with me were the psychological and emotional. You have to recognize that people are going through very emotional times and they do need counseling after that. In fact, we insisted that all of our first responders went through counseling after they went through to China or they went through to Amsterdam before they could go back to work. I thought that was important. And that counseling, though, was also part of that community component. They knew that the airline had their back and they were there for them. So it is important that they feel valued, respected, and that we're going to take care of their needs as well. So all of them are very important. For me, when I was in China, I would get up very early in the morning and just go on a treadmill just to go for a run, because I knew that by 9 o'clock in the morning, I'd have to have my first briefing ready, and you need to be ready for that. So for me, it was exercise that helped me get through that. And then the rest of the day, you're interacting with both your team, the authorities, and then with family members, etc., just to take care of everything.
No, and thanks for that. And not to throw humor to the wind here, it's it's interesting. I know both you and Bob keep yourselves very healthy. Hugh, you've been a marathon runner. Bob, you've been an avid runner your whole life. What would be the items that in addition to fitness and keeping healthy, what would be some of your main points to really add to resilience to the leaders on this call today?
Yeah, I think it starts in the middle of this chart, taking care of yourself emotionally, thinking positively. A crisis also presents opportunity. Can you personally chart a way through to the other side? And once you've convinced yourself, yes, then you begin to develop self-belief and confidence, which is conveyed directly or more so indirectly to your team. So I think coupling emotional resilience with psychological resilience is critical. And then I think an area that certainly I tend to neglect and I'm beginning to think about more is community. Who can you connect with? What are you thankful for every day? in this situation. And I think, at least my experience, people tend to probably not give as much weight to community as they should.
Well, it's interesting, Bob. Like you'd mentioned before, Winston Churchill's his quote, "You don't waste a good crisis." There's always an opportunity behind a problem. And in all of the years of executive coaching, I've been working 22 years with senior executives and helping them through challenges. And the interesting thing is if you want to be an expert in terms of resilience or more of a skilled leader in terms of resilience, then teach it, because you don't become an expert until you become a teacher. And quite frankly, Mike, just so you know, Mike, we're going to be sharing this deck with you so you can share it out with a greater population of those who took part in today's call, as well as the recording of the call with the dialogue we're having now. And feel free to pass this on to others within Baker Hughes and within the communities that you're part of. But these are key items. You look at each one. The 1 to 10 is 1 is poor, 10 is you've reached your potential. And if you rank yourself on each one of these items and how well you're standing up to it, and did a little gap analysis to say, where am I now and where could I be? Those are items that can be transposed onto others once you do it for yourself. Now, it's interesting because the next item that we'd like to touch on, beyond just leading self and some of those ideas, is the concept of leading teams. But leading teams might not be directly the teams that you have at work. We have families at home and we have families at work, the way we see it. You still go through these 4 same phases. But the interesting thing is not to go and be too complicated. From both Bob's and Hughes' perspective, leadership in times of crisis, there's really 4 components. So the core leadership behaviors in a crisis is, number 1, look after your people. Number 2, paint a vision. Start getting people looking forward, not backward. Paint a vision of maybe this afternoon or tomorrow or next week or next month, maybe even next quarter. Now, encourage and empower others so that everyone can do their part. And finally, acknowledge that these times can be highly emotional. Bob, if you don't mind me asking, out of these 4 points, which one stands out to you the most?
I think, based on my experience, number 2, paint a vision of the end of the crises. There's a saying, I don't know the source, it might have been Warren Bennett, who writes a lot about leadership, but the primary purpose of a leader is to give his or her followers hope. And there's no better way to give them hope than to actually paint a path from point A to point B on the other side of the crises. And more importantly, communicate to followers, how do you fit in and how can you contribute and do work that's associated with the recovery. And that's critically important.
Absolutely. And Hugh, what points would you focus in on here yourself?
Yeah, first of all, I totally agree with Bob. If you can't paint a vision for what's going to happen at the end of the crisis, then that's a real challenge to get people motivated to follow you and then work that way. Although the others are also important, the one that I found also that tends to sometimes get overlooked is this: encourage and empower others. This is a non-standard situation. Your normal work processes have been thrown to the side because you've got to address the crisis because it's so important. At the same time, you have a responsibility that the rest of your job continues operating. So the issue from my perspective there is that under a crisis situation, decisions have to be made relatively quickly. Some of those decisions may not be the 100% accurate ones, but if your people don't believe you have their back, they will be afraid to make decisions. So they need to know you're empowered to make these decisions, do them to the best of your ability, make sure they're sensible. And if you need to check with me, please do so. But regardless, I've got your back moving forward. I think that's very critical. In the example of Malaysia Airlines, just because I was in Beijing and I was the chief commercial officer, didn't mean the rest of the airline wasn't operating. So I had to delegate responsibility to my VPs and SVPs for them to continue the marketing and sales activities. Even that was of which was modified because you had to control. You can't be advertising vacation destinations while you're going through a major tragedy. So all of the processes changed, but you still have to make sure priority for me was take care of the family members and empower my team. I could not talk to 1,500 people each day, but I've got 200 or 300 people that are working for me that are doing that 24 hours a day. So make sure they know you've got their back.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Hugh. You know, it's interesting. I have to agree with both. You've got to paint that vision at the end of the crisis or even the vision of next week, but you've got to keep people looking forward. Now, one of the most interesting questions that I've heard some very highly accomplished leaders asking of their people over the last 3.5 months. Really, now is a time to build confidence, you know, to encourage and empower and build confidence in the minds of others, where people who are on your team, you know, take a moment, even if it's in a team meeting, and ask people within your group, what are they really proud of? What have they been focusing on most that they feel they're moving forward? You know, focus on what people are doing well. And sometimes, you know, that's something that does build a bit more resilience in an individual during interesting times. Many leaders who've come back with putting that question to work within their business, you know, it's an item of growth. It's an item of moving forward, but asking people what they feel they're doing well, or maybe even the items that they're focused on that they're most proud of. So it's just very interesting because one item I can say is that when you're actually embarking on these three items, these three circles, take the perspective of others, consider their emotion, and withhold your judgment, because the intersection of those three items is where true empathy lies. And to be an empathetic leader in these times is to pay attention to people's feelings, to ask them how they're doing, to ask them how they're feeling. Recognize that these are emotional times if we stressed. Leaders must offer support to others and portray a "we will get through this" attitude. And William, I love the quote you left in the chat. It's a quote by Napoleon Bonaparte: "A leader is a dealer in hope."
Yeah, perfect.
Now, finalizing the leading, families, leading teams. Hugh, if you looked at the items on the screen, which one draws your attention most? Oh, and I think you're muted out there, Hugh.
Apologies, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to focus on the communications part. All of these are important, and it is difficult to rank them against each other, but I would start with the communication strategy. How do you make sure that people are informed? I think I've mentioned before, if you don't communicate well, then people are going to make up their stories that will interpolate between what they do know and what they don't know. So make sure you do that. I think Bob will talk about a few of the others. One thing I also said, avoid knee-jerk decisions. Information is changing all the time, and when you're in a very turbulent, chaotic environment, and with different people having their own points of view and perspective, not necessarily all based on the same set of information, if you start knee-jerking from one direction to another during the course of the day or course of a week, it's difficult to convey to your team that you're a great leader, right? Because they're going to say, well, you told me yesterday to do this. Now you're telling me to go in the opposite direction. What will you tell me tomorrow? So you need to, confidence is about, instilling confidence is about being calm, analytic, and decide on a path and the direction you're going to take. It may not be 100% perfect, but at least move in that direction. If you do have to deviate, it should be a course change, but it should be backed up by information, not just, I've heard the latest piece of information on the news, now we're going to change direction. That gives you no time to do a proper assessment of the validity of the information and to what extent it's going to influence my current plans. With
Absolutely.
that, I'll hand it over to Bob for his.
Yeah, thanks. No, Bob, which would you highlight as the item of significance on this page?
Well, I agree with the points Hugh made, and I think as a lead into our discussion on strategy, it's critically important to have a flexible, adaptable 80% plan, because the situation is changing virtually on a daily basis. And to get locked into a 100% plan, say one that assumed recovery by December of this year, and that's not the reality, can be fatal to your company. So adaptability, flexibility in this world where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change is critical as part of a company strategy, which should ripple down to every employee within the organization.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Bob. You know, it's interesting, and I completely agree with both comments both you and Hugh made. One item to add here as well is avoiding knee-jerk decisions and reactions. You know, it's interesting because during these troubled times, again, that 80% plan, perfection is sometimes not real when you're going through complete amounts of change, the amounts of change we're going through. And it's just to have a little bit of flexibility with people and allow them to learn. Without sacrificing safety, the allowance to give people the dignity of learning during these times. This is new to many of us, and the amount people are learning is making each one of us stronger as we move through this, but allow that learning to take place. Now, we always save the best to last in terms of, the message we're passing on here. Leading organizations, we'd like to focus most on ideas and tactics for each one of the leaders on this call right now to ensure that they're moving in the most comfortable of ways to recovery and resumption. Now, it's interesting, Bob, because we've got a few considerations that we have up on the screen right now. Which items do you feel are worthy of focus most here?
I think certainly the fact that each company's revised strategy is unique to their business. Baker Hughes has a certain position within the oilfield service sector. You have an emphasis on certain technologies and certain geomarkets. Those will all be affected a little bit differently by both the price shock and the COVID crisis. So it's really important to think about in the context of the dual crises and where and how you need to change your strategy. We've already touched on that there will be some permanent changes on the other side of COVID. Certainly making supply chains more resilient, certainly where it's feasible, a lot more work from home incorporated into organizations. And then finally, as we said in the previous discussion, critically important to ripple that plan, revised strategy from the top all the way down to each individual contributor. So as we used to say at ExxonMobil, everyone can have line of sight to where the business is going.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting because, a strategy in your eyes, and this is something where I've been very much your mentee in many ways in terms of strategy and enjoying my time learning from you. What can you say about the illustration on the page here?
Yeah, I would say, strategy first became recognized as a practice probably 2,000 or 3,000 years ago within the military. And it really hasn't changed since. It's about having a structure to make decisions. It's having a framework to execute those decisions, and it's holding all the participants accountable. In the case of military, it's about winning battles. In the case of business, it's about achieving competitive advantage. So that has not changed. What has changed is the extreme volatility of this environment, layered on the fact that this affects every company in every corner of the world in some form or fashion. So adaptability and the ability to gather information that's relevant to your business, those two are absolutely critical in developing an effective strategy as we go forward.
Absolutely. And it's interesting too, because the question becomes this: do you it's not just does your company have a response plan? It's we see Baker Hughes doing great things in the marketplace even during this tricky time. But what about your area of the business? Do you have a response plan for your area of responsibility? What can you say about this, Bob?
Yeah, I think it's important. Certainly there is a high-level strategy within Baker that's probably created by the executive team, the strategy planning group, etc. But this group, probably as leaders, mid-level, and first line leaders, is critically important for you to understand what's the translation, the impact, the relevance of that strategy to your work groups and individuals, and communicate that. That's absolutely critical.
Well, and also, Bob, the upper level leaders, the cascading, are you really happy with the cascading of strategy down within your respective organizations? What can you say about that?
Well, we found in normal times, And there's been some studies by Harvard Business School that firms who can do that, create a line of sight from, say, the individual craftsperson all the way up to the executive, outperform their peers by anywhere from 5 to 8% in terms of profitability. So the value of that practice, while difficult, has been proven repeatedly.
Well, it's been fun seeing some of that respectfully as an organization through our Envision team.
Yeah.
The cascading of strategy, it's something, it's a learned item. Like, you think about it, each person on this call, where did you learn how to do strategic planning? I'd say the greater majority of people we ask that question to, it's through the School of Hard Knocks, unless you've done your MBA or beyond. Now, it's interesting because, additional components really, having a recovery plan. What can you say about the items on this screen?
Yeah, I think, and I believe in the case of most energy industry participants, Baker included, the recovery plan is really, in our view, the short term. What are you going to do over the next 2 years whilst things are still in flux and not back to normal? What are you going to carry on the business, not only to keep it stable, but potentially investigate and develop new areas of strategy execution? And it's also, we don't know at this point how long this short-term interval will last. It kind of feels like this is going to be a 1 to 2 year event. And then the second point is, as you go through recovery, how are you adapting to, for lack of a better word, I'll use the term, the new normal? When we get to post-COVID, we may have a vaccine, work practices have changed. Are you monitoring the signposts that you should be paying attention to in order to adjust your business accordingly? And so when you get to the end of the recovery plan, have you taken advantage of all the opportunities to actually resume full-scale business and have achieved a greater competitive advantage as you've worked through recovery? That's critically important. It's hard for companies to do. We are seeing a few of our clients, for example, airlines, begin to think about that now, and they will definitely be the winners when airline traffic gets close to normal again, maybe in a couple of years.
Well, and Bob, I've joked about this before. We've seen things on social media, but for you and Hugh and myself, we're usually on an airplane 3 weeks out of every month. And to feel normal, we have to pack pillows around our dryer door and put our iPads with scenery going by to feel normal and feel like we're back on a flight again. Now, Hugh, it's interesting because with your experience, Hugh, from Malaysia Airlines, is there a difference between a response plan and a recovery plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. From my perspective, there is a difference. The response plan is your immediate actions that you're going to take place as a result of the event that's taken place, whether it's an aircraft tragedy or it's the pandemic that has basically brought 95% of your airline's operations to a halt, which is probably the case worldwide. And in some of our discussions recently, we were talking with an airline where they said a key component of our network flows as we come out of the pandemic scenario is the North American market feeding through the Middle East and then into the Indian subcontinent, only to be discovered that because of the resurgence of the pandemic here in the United States, that flow will no longer happen because countries will simply not allow American citizens to depart the country and come into their country and reinfect their local population. So therefore, their plan may have been well intended, but has now changed literally in the matter of weeks because of the resurgence. So, but once you do get a plan in action, in other words, you said, okay, I'm going to restart my network. It'll be a small section of my fleet. I'm going to open up to where countries have got the virus under control. I'm going to initiate some more, let's say, hygiene procedures for health and safety in terms of how I take care of my guests, whether that's empty middle seats or greater separation at the gates, etc. That just gets me going. And it may amount to maybe 20-30% of my operation. But to go from there to full recovery, I need to have a plan in place to say, how do I get back to 80 to 90% of my network? That will simply take time, because I've now got a scenario where the people themselves, the customers, are seriously concerned about their health and safety. That previously never used to be a worldwide issue. But I think there'll be a follow-on in how willing people will be to travel, unless they're confident that the airlines themselves and the airports have enough safety precautions in mind. So I think it'll be a parallel development in terms of how countries reopen for business, how confident the consumers will be that their health and safety is top of mind, and then what's the likely risk of reinfection just because someone or one country or one region wasn't as careful about the situation as another region was. So it'll transition, I think, from that recovery phase as we start to open up the network, 10-20%, to the response phase to recovery, and then ultimately to the resumption, which I suspect will be at least a couple of years down the road.
Well, it's interesting, Hugh. It's you look at this. I'm not sure. I'd have to say that the majority of people on this call, you leaders from Baker Hughes, are seasoned travelers. And how many of us? I'm just going to pose this as more of just a question to be unanswered. Is how many of us would really be comfortable hopping in that middle seat on an aircraft back in coach class in economy? But there's going to be immediate items to be focused on, and there's survival imperatives, Bob, isn't there, moving forward as an organization and as a team? Can you touch on this?
Yeah, and I think most firms have already taken action on preserving cash flow, restructuring debt. They've maybe shrunk, not by intention, but just by trying to live within their cash flow means. But I think, as we move forward, it's the firms who outperform their competition will have a very thoughtful plan to shrink in order to reposition and grow. I can think of Baker, and it's pretty likely that on the other side of this crisis, the shale industry will be much smaller than it is today, which I don't believe affects your business, because the group here is around subsea and subsea systems. But on the other hand, it's likely that capital will return to deep water. And so that has positive implications for your business unit. And hopefully you're beginning to contemplate, how will you monitor and step into that shift in investment if it does occur. And then finally, it's what are your bundle of products? How do you price? And is your competitive advantage the same as it was before? Or are there some changes you need to make in order to reposition yourself? So I think the last two items, shrinking to grow and repositioning products, competitive advantage, and even geographies in which you compete, are the areas for longer term that top will put a lot of time and effort and thought into.
It's interesting, Bob, because as we switch to the next slide, there is a question posed by Mike. And Mike, our host of the call today, he asked, have you witnessed or observed any best practices with regard to fallback principles on the recovery plan? And just to add to that, at Baker Hughes, we have been consistently conservative in our approach to recovery to ensure stability. So what would you have to say about fallback principles?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, Mike and team, it's early days. I mean, we're seeing little hints here and there of firms who are doing things right. I think some of the airlines we've talked to, not domestic, but more so international, are beginning to be more thoughtful about shrink to grow and how do you reposition. Um, Certainly, I've worked with some clients in the medical field, which is very different than, energy and energy services. And they have responded, some of the firms, very quickly, very efficiently in repositioning their offerings, their products, to support the coronavirus. But that's more of um, a very specific response. So I don't think, because it's early days, we're not seeing one or two firms that we would hold up as the exemplar in terms of response. We'll probably know in another 6 months. I don't know. What would you add to that, Hugh?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. The issue is that the most important point is that when Bob talked about having that 80% plan, that 20% is your ability to react to changing environments. I gave the example of a carrier which said we're going to downsize from 140, 150 aircraft down to about 70. We're going to start doing work in this area, only to discover that was no longer possible. Therefore, they had to go back and replan. In an environment, though, where everything is already dynamic and you've just added another extra turbulent variable, to give you an idea, at a typical airline, international airline with maybe a global network, we might be filing 20 to 30,000 new fares per day, every day. So it's a highly competitive environment and you have to be able to do that. So for them, the issue has not been about more chaos in the environment. It's been the fact that all travel has basically become suspended. And so what they've had to do is reset their normal operations from dealing with that level of turnover in terms of actions into how do I stop things happening completely? And that's what they've been forced to do. Even carriers here in the States and Canada, even with massive amounts of funding to help them survive, have been letting go of tens of thousands of staff as they try and protect their cash flow. I think the issue is going to be monitoring what are the key indicators, as Bob said, of what's happening in the market. Can I open up in a steady and phased way? And I think I use the policy of minimum regret. Okay, if things go wrong, am I willing to accept that, or do I want to take an action that protects me? So for those states that decided they would open earlier because they were more optimistic than they should have been, they weren't following that policy. Now they're going to be forced probably to close down again. And I know politically that may not be an acceptable situation because people do need to get back to work. We do want our children to go back to school. I think we're all aligned in terms of the overall goals and objectives. The question of where we differ is on what are the safety criteria I wish to apply or need to satisfy before I will be willing to let my children go back to work, or before I'm willing to have myself go back to an office where potentially other people may give me the infection as well. So it's more about setting those criteria about what's more important to me, having a job, getting back to work, or protecting the safety not only of myself but of my family members when I go home at the end of the day. So I think it's adjusting those criteria that will be able to differentiate one company from another. And as you said, Baker Hughes has focused more on being stable and being more cautious, which in this situation is probably the best situation to be in. That's something that I would fully support.
Yeah, and just a couple, I was thinking as you were talking, Hugh, I think a couple emerging best practices that we're seeing is companies with strong balance sheets are view this as an opportune time to pick up strategic acquisitions. There's no better time to buy selectively if you have a strong balance sheet, especially in the energy industry, especially in the energy services industry. And then the other practice I'm seeing firms who seem to be doing well is they have pivoted their business strategy in several instances to a better fit to providing services to support coronavirus response. Now, that's not at all applicable to Baker, but I think at the more senior level within Baker, it's pretty clear to me that, as I said earlier, the capital investment is going to shift away from shale. And so the question to Baker is, where will that go? Will it go deep water? Will it go back to oil sands? So the better you have a crisp view of that, I think the better positioned you are to beat my old firm, Schlumberger, and beat our mutual competitor, Halliburton.
Well, and the Up and Rising group next here as well. That's there's certain items to be looking at. Now, it's interesting, Bob, because moving forward for strategy, there's a question that was by Vermel Vimo that I'll get to in just a moment. My apologies with your name. I'm just reading the notes with glasses that need to be replaced post-COVID. But looking at these key items that are on the screen right now, what can you say about really recovery plans in terms of these key areas?
Well, I think we advocate identifying the major core processes of any company, and this is an illustrative set, but it's probably pretty relevant to Baker with maybe a few omissions. And in each of these areas, have you thought through coronavirus and price shock impact? Have you identified what should stay the same, what needs to be modified, and in a number of instances, what should we stop doing? And then have you developed a plan to address those changes? And do you have teams working on and executing to reposition the firm? Because we know how teams work. Oh, that's fine, Pat. And certainly we talked within the oilfield service sector, supply chain management and procurement is going to change significantly. In the short term, there may have been interruptions to suppliers, to Baker. There may have been bankruptcies. There may be some issues around your inventory, but as importantly, there may be some issues around operators' inventory who may want to increase their level of stocking. So that should all be examined in detail, thought about, and then addressed first from the internal needs of Baker Subsea, but also what's the impact with respect to your supply chain? How do you reduce risks, de-risk it in the event of potentially a future occurrence of a virus, but also dealing with the immediate issues. And then, likely with the potential reduction in immediate demand from your clients is how do you address that short term, maybe by reducing your effort in this area, but longer term, do you have a plan to begin to restore your capability?
Absolutely. So it's interesting when you look through the major processes, and an additional question here. Longer term, we need to ask these three questions. Has our competitive position changed? What do we need to change, and what do we need to stop doing? Just as you'd mentioned.
Yeah, and we've hit most of these points, with the exception of in volatile times, lots of uncertainty, lots of change, which is, I'll go back to my military analogy. Military planners are big advocates of scenario planning, worst case, maybe middle case, and best case. And so we strongly advocate from a strategy point of view, firms like Baker and firms in the airline industry, whatever industry, is think about what are those three scenarios that your business might face, what are the telltales, milestones, information markers, and then have in place the ability to adjust from plan A to plan B to plan C as you see the actual changes in the marketplace begin to unfold. I think that's probably the most critical part of a a strategy that will be highly adaptable and likely to give you a competitive advantage over the next couple of years.
Absolutely. No, it's interesting. Here's just a summary of some of the items that we've been talking about. What I'd like to do, Bob and Hugh, is just to address this final question from Vimal, is picking on your picking on your collective experience as you were managing and responding to the crisis at hand. You know, Hugh, in your situation, and Bob, in your experience, how did you really plan or gear up for another crisis completely different from the first to land while you were still going to continue addressing the first?
Yeah, so that's a tough question. So I'll let Hugh take that one.
Yeah, give the doctorate level guy the opportunity to jump with this question.
I mean, it is a great question. It's like saying, how do you plan for the unplannable? Well,
correct.
The answer is, as Bob said, you do scenario planning. You look at various scenarios for worst case, expected, and optimistic case. And the answer is sometimes we frequently don't make the worst case as bad as it could be. Why? Because you get a lot of pushback from management saying that's an unrealistic scenario. Nothing will ever get that bad. Well, the truth is it frequently does get that bad. So I think this pandemic has been an eye-opener for people to say when things go bad, they can get really bad, and they can get really bad really quickly. So just to re-emphasize what Bob said, scenario planning is critical. And I think that should be a key component of how we prepare an organization for what can potentially happen in the future. So I do believe that's something that's really critical for us. And then the next question is, do you have the right people, the right skill sets, the right demeanor to actually lead an organization through those situations? And if they don't have those skill sets, it doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means that they're not attuned for dealing with this type of crisis. Can that be trained? I'm not the psychologist who can make a comment on that, because most of the very definition of a crisis is something that is out of the normal. It's very difficult to have people go through that in the past and then be prepared for it the next time. But we can all learn. And I think an important part of this pandemic will be the learnings that we gain from this and how we integrate those into our leadership and how we address those problems going ahead in the future.
Absolutely. And you know, we're right at the top of the hour now, Bob. It's interesting, you know, within the Envision team, Hugh, Bob, myself, we do strategic planning and we do alignment of strategic planning as well as training and supporting leaders. So it's interesting. The two things that we'd like to pose to you as questions. First, are you happy with your current business strategy as we move through recovery and start to look at resumption? And the second one, are you really happy with the alignment and execution of your business strategy within your business unit? So to pose those two questions, you know, Mike, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you and to your international team for having us on the call today. With any questions from material that we posed, Mike, we're going to send you a copy of the deck to distribute to your team. What I'd like to do is just, I think, one last question that we see on the screen here right now. We'll get back to Mike with the answer to that. Amin, if that's okay. Now, Mike, thank you once again for having us on behalf of the Envision team, Bob, Hugh, and myself. We're just very grateful that you gave us the opportunity to speak to your group. We hope we passed on items of use, ideas, tactics, and strategies. Mike, once again, thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say to close off today's call?
Thanks, Pat. First of all, thank you back to you guys. Pat, Hugh, Bob, awesome to hear all your perspectives. Great deck of information, but the experiences I think were, you know, invaluable to hear what you guys had to say. I took a tremendous amount of notes, despite having heard some of this before. It was just awesome to see how, as you said, stuff, it was resonating, whether it resonated with, hey, I think we do good in that area, or hey, I think it's somewhere we can improve. Took a lot of great notes. I'm sure others did as well. And the couple of things I highlighted as kind of a way to maybe takeaways from me, and I'll hit the quotes that I heard because I think they hit on your categories. In the self piece, you know, don't waste a good crisis. There's a lot of opportunity in this. There's a lot of silver lining. We're seeing it all the time. It always comes with a bit of pain as well, but there's always positivity as you look through that lens and think of what you could do differently. The other one was leaders deal in hope. And that's with the leadership of individuals, with teams, collectively. Awesome example about positivity. And then also the policy of minimum regret. As you look at the organization, you look at your decisions, I highlighted a lot of things, but that summed up a lot, I think, of what you guys talked about today. And I just really appreciate you guys sharing that with us. And looking forward to the follow up on books or references that people could read and kind of continue to learn on. So just thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome. And watch for some of our training, Mike, the executive level training through PISA, Petroleum Equipment and Services Association, sessions coming up in the fall, and of course in the Middle East coming up soon. And we just wanted to say thanks to you and your team and wish you all the best in next steps.
Thank you, everyone.